The following program is produced by Project Bait and does not reflect the views of this station.
This is Mark Wells, and this is part 2 of the Wells Report on Cuba for My People. In part 1 of my report on Cuba, I reported that 60 prominent African-American scholars, activists, and public figures had signed a letter directed toward the Cuban government requesting the immediate release of political prisoner Darsi Ferrer. Ferrer has been held in a prison located west of the city of Havana since July. Those familiar with this case see it as a clear example of racism being used as a means to silence a dissident that dares to expose the shortcomings of the Cuban government. Part of the document, entitled Acting on Our Conscience, reads, quote, "As African Americans, we know firsthand the experiences and consequences of denying civil freedoms on the basis of race. And we certainly understand what racial discrimination is and does to people. We have not tolerated it for ourselves and will certainly not acquiesce in its perpetuation against other people." Unquote. Another voice of solidarity in support of Dr. Ferrer is the 95-year-old Afro-Brazilian activist Abdias do Nascimento. Nascimento has been the most recognized leader of the Afro-Brazilian civil rights movement for more than 60 years and has also been a longtime supporter of Cuba. But in a letter addressed to both Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, and Raul Castro, the president of Cuba, Nascimento wrote the following words, quote, "We know that Dr. Darsi Ferrer is not a criminal. The facts show that, in function of his long militancy for the civil and human rights of marginalized populations in Cuba, and its vast majority of African ancestry, the Cuban authorities decided to try to silence his voice that bothered them." Unquote. In response to these letters, the Cuban government issued its own 5-page letter defending the country's record in providing opportunities for Afro-Cubans and denouncing the accusations of racism as an attack on Cuba's national identity. Cuba's response went on to remind its critics that it was Cuba that sent its troops to Africa in support of independence movements, as well as providing free educational exchange programs and medical schooling for African students. It also reminded its critics that it was Cuba that offered aid to victims of Hurricane Katrina, even though the Bush administration turned it down. Presented with these facts, does this automatically exclude Cuba from being scrutinized in reference to its Afro-Cuban population? After all, wasn't Cuba the dream destination of hundreds of African-American activists of the 60s, 70s, and beyond? Well, in my view, the Cuban government's argument is tantamount to the old red herring deception. Their defense is kind of like saying because African Americans have the highest standard of living of all African descendants in the world, the 3,400 recorded lynchings of African Americans between the years 1882 and 1968 shouldn't matter. But let's analyze the Cuban situation a little closer. When the European Union recently sent social scientists to Cuba to study the racial situation, they discovered widespread systemic as well as institutional racism. Afro-Cubans were excluded from jobs where they would be in regular contact with tourists and thus earning generous tips. Most Afro-Cubans live in subpar housing, wait the longest for health care, are excluded from managerial employment positions, and are 5 times more likely to be jailed than those Cubans identifying themselves as white. Of the 39 members of Cuba's top governing body, the Council of Ministers, only 2 are Afro-Cuban. And although blacks and whites have equal education, 73% of the nation's scientists and technicians and 80% of its college professors are white. Today, the Cuban government claims that Afro-Cubans make up about 35% of Cuba's 12 million citizens. But according to the U.S. State Department, as well as the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami, Afro-Cubans actually constitute anywhere from 62 to 70% of the Cuban population. But this wasn't always the case. When Fidel Castro assumed power in Cuba 50 years ago, white Cubans made up about 55 to 65% of the island's population. But with the rise of the Castro regime, about 20% of Cuba's white population fled the island in fear of the effects of a socialist government. Today, those Cubans and their descendants are the reason that census reports estimate that 85% of the 1.5 million Cubans living in South Florida today are classified as white. This Miami-based population contributes to yet another form of inequality in which Afro-Cubans come up on the short side of the stick. Because white Cubans make up 85% of the South Florida Cuban American population, white families living in Cuba receive the vast majority of the estimated $1.5 billion worth of remittances sent from relatives in the United States yearly. Over the years, the Castro regime has attempted to keep a lid on Cuba's glaring racial inequalities. In 1961, Castro outlawed 526 Afro-Cuban organizations known as the Colored People's Societies, Cuba's equivalent of a civil rights movement. The official government's response to charges of racism has been denial, arguing that in a communist egalitarian society, racism wasn't possible. But today's growing Afro-Cuban movement has more than enough evidence to prove its case. 75% of black and white Cubans today agree that racial prejudice is a problem on the island, and several recent works solidify their opinions. The release of the book Race and Inequality in Cuba Today by Rodrigo Espina and Pablo Rodriguez Ruiz angered the Cuban government, while another book, The Challenges of the Racial Problem in Cuba by Esteban Morales Dominguez, was banned by Cuban officials. Other important works on the racial situation in Cuba include Carlos Moore's Pichon, Race and Revolution in Castro's Cuba, and Alejandro de la Fuentes' A Nation for All, Race, Inequality, and Politics in 20th Century Cuba. So while the Obama administration ponders the loosening of American travel to Cuba and the 5 decades-long commercial economic embargo imposed on Cuba, keep in mind the plight of those 8 million Cubans that look nothing like Fidel Castro. This is Mark Wells, and this has been part 2 of a report on Cuba for My People.
I'm Geraldine Watkins, the director of the Considine Little Rock Family Life Center, located at 8904 Woodward Avenue at the corner of Holbrook in Detroit. We offer swimming, basketball, as well as a full fitness center. We also have a beautiful hall available for rental of all occasions. For more information regarding programming and services, please contact us at 313-871-4673. Again, 313-871-4673.
If you are in business, you should promote your business in the Metro Business Information Guide. For more information, contact Chris Woodard at 645-2282. That's 313-645-2282.
The preceding program was produced by Project BAIT and does not reflect the views of this station.